Your Holiness, we will continue with the theme of consciousness, and what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is to give a short presentation that follows directly from a theme that you introduced in your book that really very much comes from the work of Francisco. And I'd like to begin with two quotes, and this is in regard to the integration of first and third person methods. And these are two quotes from your book. The first says, "A comprehensive scientific study of consciousness must therefore embrace both third person and first person methods. It cannot ignore the phenomenological reality of subjective experience, but must observe all the rules of scientific rigor. Here I feel a close collaboration between modern science and the contemplative tradition such as Buddhism could prove beneficial." And the next quote, "I believe that it is possible for Buddhism and modern science to engage in collaborative research in the understanding of consciousness while leaving aside the philosophical question of whether consciousness is ultimately physical. But we'll come back to that. By bringing together these two modes of inquiry, both disciplines may be enriched." So it is in that spirit that I would like to show you some actual data that we have collected in our laboratory that is inspired by these comments, by this view, and by the work that Francisco began. And this is work that's been continued in my laboratory by Antoine Lutz, who is a graduate student of Francisco's, who I think is here somewhere. There's Antoine. So in this experiment, we have long-term practitioners. And they are engaged in meditation practice. And we have them rating with a keyboard. So they have a keyboard which they are pressing during meditation. And they rate on a 1 to 9 point scale variations in the clarity of their experience. Selcha.
세자, 제 되면 now that 안개 찍네 주부도샤, 제 토부에는 안개 토부잡, 제 세자 토부시라라면은 네 안개 용한잡, 대미게 수수 감님 그거서 검잡 주잖아.
And so what we see is that through their experience there is some variation. They may begin during meditation to start at a low number, like 1 or 2 or 3, that we see here. And then as their meditation deepens, it can go to 5 or 6 or 7, and so on. So it changes during the meditation period. During the meditation...
So what kind of seja you're talking about? Are they meditating on single-pointedness?
We have done this with open presence meditation as well as with compassion.
What do you mean by selcha here?
So,
because there's that, there could be the clarity of the object, the image of the object, or it could be clarity of the actual subjective experience. So the clarity can mean two different things.
I think in this case it was the clarity of the experience.
Yes, also because it's objectless meditation, in principle, this meditation.
So, as we have seen, I showed some of these results before, but just to remind you, Your Holiness, during meditation, what we see is there is a change in a signal in the brain that is the kind of signal that Wolf Singer described in the oscillations in this high-frequency range, the gamma range of brain oscillations. And if you look At the right-hand graph, we have the novices and we have the long-term practitioners. And you can see that during the meditation practice, there is a much larger increase in this gamma signal in the brain of the long-term practitioners compared to the novices. The question, though, is how does the variation, the changes in the brain oscillations, relate to the changes in the experience that the practitioners report in the clarity of their experience? And so here is one example. Now, the red line corresponds to the rating that the practitioner gives for the clarity of his experience during the meditation. So as this red line goes from low levels to higher levels, the clarity increases. But we encourage the practitioner to report with total honesty about their experience. And so if there's a dip in the clarity momentarily, they should tell us that there is a dip. And so you can see here, the red line goes down and there's a dip, and then it goes back up. And there's some variation over the course of the meditation. The blue line is the gamma signal, the signal from the brain. And what we see is really a remarkable close correspondence between the variation in clarity and the variation in the brain signal that we record. So as the clarity goes up, the brain signal goes up, and as the clarity goes down, the brain signal goes down. And for this kind of research, this is a very close correspondence between a first-person report and a third-person measurement. This is not unique to just one practitioner. We have seen this pattern in every long-term practitioner that we have studied. So here's another example. This is from a different practitioner, but it is across different days. So we had the practitioner come back on several different days and different meditation periods each day. And each time...
What the differences between morning and afternoon, morning and evening?
Not systematic. Yeah, we haven't studied that, so we don't know.
But generally, morning is thought to be better for the clarity of the subjective experience.
We did most in the morning.
Yeah, most of them have been in the morning. But what is really striking...
He was wondering whether they'd eaten or not.
Breakfast or not?
We feed our practitioners very, very well.
Yes, of course.
His Holiness's question was, when the experiment was being done, is it just soon after what they have eaten?
Early.
Now, for example, some yoga practice prefer empty stomach. So it's some because of the relations about our brain activities.
Brain activity.
And digestion. And digestion.
Oh.
It's a good question, Your Holiness. We have not studied that. But again, what is...
the Matthieu 때문에 그들이야 deep게 차바로 그 도면도 지 밍밍이다 지 가서 우리 그리고 쪽샤서도 스타냐 대대에 그두기 그기 가서 우리 리모트다 다야 변치 닝지 유직 넘버로야 서치체 냠타고 심전 지 넘버 서치니 디가는 닝지도 공백 그들이야 직도가 유나로 지게 어려다 디피그나 나스 맨다 중도
다다데 율첸 너서 지다 다 믹베트 테스트다 체요 말에 가서나 딘나라야 메모리 더 비주얼 에리아 뭐보 용거도 와.
그래.
데 믹메 닌제나 그런 닌제 경바 다시 가바세르나 die das Tombone Tagrita, Jema no so ya, Chi Yula, Shukshamboya, Sharne no so Taya Taguri.
유지 나봐 멘탈 차버를 용을
You want to explain that?
Yeah, His Holiness was requesting, and that's something we have been very aware of, is in the meditation of compassion. There are two kinds. One is based on focusing on the person who is suffering and giving rise to a powerful feeling of compassion, that is the wish that the suffering may be removed and the causes of suffering. And then what we try to, in this case, the sort of non-referential or unconditional compassion, which is a general feeling of loving kindness and compassion, but not specifically with an object. And what I mentioned to His Holiness is that we definitely need to study both because they're probably quite different. But one of the reasons why we decided to choose, I think in the beginning, whether this was the right choice, is because if we have an object, then it will also involve visual areas, memories, all kinds of other emotions.
Exactly.
And our idea
Exactly.
was if the practitioner can generate a very pure feeling of compassion, we have more chance to sort of isolate what compassion alone could do in the brain. But definitely we should extend to empathic compassion, which is really based on the suffering person.
Yes. But the choice was made for experimental reasons to first start with non-referential compassion. So what this slide shows, Your Holiness, is each label here, A1, A2, A3, each of those is a different practitioner. And the blue line is the correlation between the gamma signal in the brain and the phenomenological report, the first-person report, and for different meditation blocks for each of the practitioners. And what is striking is that virtually every one of these blue lines is really quite high. And so there's considerable consistency across all of the practitioners in showing this very striking association. Usually when we do these kinds of studies, we have to average across many people to see results. What we see here are significant results in each individual practitioner in showing a significant association between their first-person report and the third-person measurement from the brain.
No, 충분히 못했어. 그런데 원세지다다 아니 레벨 남주 듣고 싶었어.
So this summarizes the findings from 9 long-term practitioners. Now here, if you just pay attention to the right side of the figure, which is for the gamma activity, what you can see in this...
Maybe we should... can someone switch off that light over there? No, over there. There's a switchboard on the back there.
It's okay. Very good, thank you. What we can see is that the correlation between the first-person report and the third-person measurement is stronger in this is looking down at the head, is stronger this is the frontal region, and you can see it very clearly here. So in this red area is where you see the higher correlation between the reports of the practitioners and the changes in the brain. So it's not something that you see everywhere. You see it in most striking in the frontal region of the brain here. So those are the findings that we have observed relating the third-person measurement to the first-person reports. And one of the hypotheses which motivates this work is that among individuals who have cultivated their mind, who have spent years training their mind, we actually should observe a much stronger correlation between the reports of their experience and changes in the brain. And this is exactly what we are finding here. The correlations between their reports and what we observe in the brain are quite striking and higher than what we typically see in individuals who have not trained their mind. So I want to end this very short presentation with 2 questions for Your Holiness. The first question is, according to the Buddhist view, there is a certain kind of primary or fundamental consciousness that can be separate from biology. And if this is true, can you provide a Buddhist account of how consciousness and changes in the brain can become so intimately correlated as we've just seen here?
All of these are really, we're talking at the level of what the Buddhists would call gross level of consciousness.
So, Your Holiness, can you, I understand that in the Buddhist conception there are 3 different dimensions or types of consciousness: gross, subtle.
Yes.
And I wonder if you can help the scientists understand more about this so that we can understand what our measurements may actually be relating to.
남시. 남과. 도시 디타니야 또 담는 게. 다베 조선이 야수도 사추 메룽. 아니
남거지.
남거 주로 샤움로. 사추 메룽 남시 남가. 남시 팀주잖아요. 러시아 육군도지도 가지고 다 룽가. 룽라고 지가. 아니 러시아 육군도가. 다지네 난갈이야 이 동거시듯이. now cheba nito ese di 동거시듯이 동거사디 디 쉐바보도 런시지 주다고 있으셔 디보도 배지 레벨레가 배지가
So yeah,
공수야 돼 주다 다 남시 바로 남시라 양 텐션 바시 된 거를 봐라
그래
다 네가 소 들었던 거
가서 그래
how it become associated no that the now ten sarbashi now zong
ten sarbashi le dewa kan chabo
템비젤라 되네
디 라베 ten 팀사리 젤라 ten 처음부터 돼야 거다 현지 뉴메 룽살 돼야 거 거다 그 기지기지기데 두어두고제디 셴 마자 거다 토마토만 차려 저자 라바 루브르의 룽심 차량이 실디가 내는데
그래. So we already had
저자 만주 셰베 테마타긴 탑도 이렇게 해지가 되고
we already had some reference to this idea of different stages of dissolution of consciousness, finally converging upon this very subtle state of consciousness, which is this non-duality of subtle energy and awareness. So we spoke about, from the Buddhist point of view, a point where there is a dissolution described of what is known as the 80 conceptions indicative of mental processes. Conception is not the right term, but for want of a better word. So 80 types of thoughts that are indicative of mental processes. So basically the various levels of consciousness are really seen as expressions of the different levels of activity of this energy, vayu or lung. And within this reality of the mental experiences, we speak of different types of thoughts or mental states. There is a list of 80, that are indicative of the mental processes that dissolve at the point of death.
다 우투는 이렇게 쇼면도 뭐로 주기다 문진나는 숭셔버티 다르시 대주스잖아.
So this has been, listed by Nagarjuna in one of the texts. So these are the mental processes identified by Nagarjuna that dissolve, that the dissolution of which marks the point of death. And then, so up to that point, the mental processes would be all seen as being based upon biology, on brain. So when that point arrives, the conscious experiences cease, breathing processes come to an end. And then the next stage is referred to as appearance. And then there's another stage, increasingly now subtle. So again, this English term appearance is dangerous, misleading. So even in the Tibetan term, we have this ambiguity and misleading, kind of potential for misleading, but it's not in the sense of a conscious perceptual experience that has appearances to it. But the term appearance is used. The next stage after that is known as the increase. There's a different way of describing these different 4 stages of dissolution that marks the important points of dissolution, which uses the language of emptiness, the term emptiness. Now, this is different from the philosophical concept of emptiness. Here, emptiness is the emptying of mental processes. So when the 80 conceptions indicative of mental processes cease, that's the first stage of emptiness, and then it's simply referred to as emptiness. The next stage is attained when the slightly subtler levels of consciousness and the medium or the vayu, the energy, ceases. So this stage is referred to as great empty. And then the great empty.
Well, then you have
very empty,
extremely empty.
Sorry, very empty or extremely empty. And then the next phase is referred to as the great empty. And so the final phase is referred to as the total emptiness. So that marks the subtlest, most state of awareness, and that is referred to also as the clear light. And that's the non-dual, energy and consciousness.
다 팀님 그림 되는 시 게임이잖아요. 룽라고 표현이잖아요. 다 뒤로도 세제.
그래.
탐정도 뭐서 뒤디샤. 다 탐정도 뭐서네. 아니 녀석. 되네 쳐봐. 말해. 르르. 쳐봐. 되네 나와.
그래. So just as there is a dissolution process, we kind of converging upon increasingly subtler state, culminating at a point where there is total emptiness and just the clear light, this non-dual energy and awareness. Similarly, emergence of embodiment is also seen in exact opposite cycle. So from this total emptiness, the clear light state comes to a gross, comparatively a grosser level, which is the next stage. That evolves into a slightly grosser level.
And at what point does it make contact with biology again?
So after the 4th stage.
The 4th period, the brain activity is completely stopped. So I think clinically that, but still some process.
Some processes.
Kevalan gana the Jotan Kandides.
겨울 그래.
라리 다간다 류사바단 대화창으로
그래. 다디 내가 인생 잘못하고 있는 걸로 들이도와 당신도 거기서 들이도와. 먼저 가서 저도 저거만 저리 가서
공부죠.
뭐저 지시 하네. 유모제서 깨었으면 유모제. 다 저거 말다. 뭐시한다 뭐 근데 대해서 그 시스템 참 줄로 시스템 참을 겨샤 말বে. 타긴 하듯이 시행이잖아요.
시스템을
다 시스템 참을 다녔을 때 야말때 간다 타긴 하듯이 시행이잖아요. 치외 내고 셈라 개미를 놓고 대시 말বে. 타긴 하듯이 시행이죠. 그봐. 당 뭐 근들이야. 셈가 남샤 차로 치면 이잖아요. 시스템 참을 놓고 대비 겹어요. 그러다. 다전에 뭐 알람에 걸리는 난조 또기 시스템 참을 겨울 겨야 유셔.
no.
그봐. 다른 거 시작을 하래.
단디 류사바 자는데.
어때서 다 사실 그게 답변은 벌써 이번 다음에 있는다. 다 상한 라미가 치르셔 주지 원서 있나? 다 겨워지면디 양내지 감정들이 루지라야 제. 이래서 내지 감정들이 루나야 기 벌쓰시나. 그봐. 다 벌써 먼저 나를이야. 치워외세 풍군님부터 나오는 치워외세 샤니 치워외세 가고도 되는도 바로 줘야 돼. 바로 두배 바로 딱 가서 주마타네 얘는 또 같이 무슨 뜻이야. 다전에 바로디 닝성자의 내가리야 바로디 바로 쿠라 의리야 슝네 바로 가게 내가더라 야 대지 가서 그래 좀 루도디만 샤용 거야래 간다 깨슴 당구자 알아 봐. 내가 왜 살이셔야 돼.
그래서 나무들로
배지를 셔 왜세. 바로 가
류도 대화창으로 류랑고도 대화창으로.
또 뒤에 남시 중성으로 간다.
no.
남시 중성으로 잡았다. 저한테 차트가 아니나.
yes.
다 dinne 아니 나와서부터 마차 나와서부터 차 되네다 러시지 또 요인 있잖아요. 다 제 처음으로 따고 다 저할래 거야.
yes.
패지들이.
So it's
사인이 zweibare mal da
no,
봐.
it's a complex
저 다도 되고.
it's a complex question and also
Is there an explanatory gap?
and also we have to take into account the multiplicity of explanations within the Buddhist tradition itself. So you have, for example, with respect to the dying moment of consciousness in the Abhidhamma Kosha, which is the standard Abhidhamma text, there is a discussion that the dying moment mental states can be a non-virtuous, kind of a afflicted state of mind. Whereas when you move on to
아니야 유수야 그래.
치심
시스템이 시스템 가서 누구한테 말다 시스템 가서 그래.
나중에 뭐 보죠.
파지 타는 쉐이잖아요.
나래.
게임 숨자로 열어.
나래 나오.
딱 끼었으면 이모저서 가서 그래. 가. 그 차단 걸로 제대로 지르스 거다 들베. 파지들이.
근데 뭐 보군도 재미는 로마데 요레스키실. 대송거로 봐.
다 뭐 근들이야 시스템 참을라 로마데 미쳐서 그래 봐. 그래서 계속 참을도 가 있는 것이다.
So
파부터는 젠데시 나오므로.
Well, in the Abhidhamma Kosha, there is
근데 그러자도 시스템 참을 로마데 뭐 타제사로 봐. 세브샤요로 봐. 딱 계속 참을도 가래. 이 뭐가 저제 이니 뭐지
발진아 내 다갈랍 되겠다. 그래. 발진아에 계시 그래서 계획서 뭐지 다가랑 랍 되고. 그래.
발진물래.
발진아 키운 거.
다 세브케 매를 유지하는 당 뭐 지샤지. 동이 물어다.
그래.
발진 발진시당 뭐 근데
도우지도로 나.
그래.
그래.
근데 나는 세브 매체. 엔다 저는 제가 다른 인샤지지.
Well, His Holiness was saying that since this question has not been explicitly addressed in the text, So he has to speculate, and he was saying it could be partly kind of a hit and miss, shooting in the blind, in the dark. So drawing from the various sources, one source is Abhidhammakosha, which has a lot to say about the last moment of dying consciousness and the first moment of a rebirth, the consciousness at the first moment of a rebirth. In Abhidhammakosha system, the consciousness as the first moment of rebirth is defined as necessarily afflicted, because rebirth is connected. The connection into the next birth is made through an afflicted state of mind. And in Abhidhamma Samuccaya, which is Asanga's text, there doesn't seem to be any explicit discussion of this. But in other perspectives, like in Perfection of Wisdom perspective, we tend to adopt the Abhidhammakosha, which is explicit statement. But to bring the Vajrayana perspective, then it is understood that advanced meditator can consciously take rebirth, and in that way they can actually, the first moment of a consciousness in a new birth can be also a virtuous state of mind. So to go back to the question of how does this subtle awareness, consciousness connect to the new body, in the Buddhist language it is the new body. So imagine a person, a human being dies, goes through this dissolution processes, and when reaches the final state of total emptiness, which is the clear light, then from that state, the next level of evolvement, evolution would be to connect with the intermediate state.
The end of the clear light.
End of the clear light.
Then depart from the body.
So then that connects with the intermediate state, Pardo.
So we believe those people who remain, although clinically dead, but body still remain fresh because of clear light still there in the body. Although brain work, because of the brain function, completely ceased.
So so from this, once the clear light state ends, then the consciousness leaves the body and then connects with the intermediate state, which is a subtle state of embodiment, and goes through this kind of reversal process. And when the intermediate state existence connects with a new birth, it's say in a conception, that first instance of consciousness in that conception is thought to be actually the clear light state. And then from there, it evolves into these grosser levels. So when the 80 conceptions indicative of mental processes begin, that's when the full embodiment, the kind of biological processes begin from there. And then from that point onwards, there is a much clearer descriptions in the text. For example, there is a text called the Entry into the Womb, Nanda's Entry into the Womb Sutra. And there's also a text on dependent origination, which describes in fairly quite detailed way the developmental processes of the fetus, and when the sensory faculties develop and the limbs arises, and all of these are developed, presented in a developmental process. His Holiness is asking one of the monks here whether he has a clearer memory of a particular text, as this text explicitly talks about these processes that we have been discussing. Not so.
So once the connection is made between...
다 deep 녀석 잘 거다. 미시겐실이야. 다 삼당 거다. 야나네. 난저 봐. 다 사운드는 시샤비는 다 하는 귤 다 털을 녀지 가는 샤워로 봐. 하장 공부래. 이번 미스의 시즌이 이제 말에 맞아. 시 하장 공부를 받다. 다 이네 이제 류행 또 강성 여정이지 싸우 거선 냠니 지도도와. 다 세두지 싸우 거선 니두지 싸우 거선 냠니 또저 영화용에 지면이나 다 열다. 근데 칠임 지다하신도 안도 루 뒤에 봐 드림도 지게야 말이지 이네 강성 지게 드림시도 거도와. 배는 정신이 주 따고 자샤네 차라 몽송도와. 정신이 따고 라고 들으마 뛴줘야지. 배는 가서 니 집에 쓰면 그돌이야. 니 집에서 잘 되잖아. 다 내가 전에 니 집에서기 낭시 토송 도되기도 와. 다 전에 밀음 샤링 되잖아. 그냥 룩도 뒤에 따라 샤용도 와. 아니 밀음 류 송니. 아? 밀음 류 송투나. 자. 밀음이 뭐시 밀음 류 야부지 송투나. 밀음 류 뒤때네. 이 드링 미고 제바이나 사고르도야. 다 롱도야 숙셔야 되지도 봐. 다 데즈제디 찍잖아. 다제치아 possibility 찍잖아. 매너. 용시버지다.
So this raises
야고 주는 패지스 류행 똑같게 되는 패지스 용도면. 류행 조른 거다 봤다.
This raises a very difficult question and complicated question about whether or not this kind of phenomena can be, observable through the scientific experiments that we are talking about. One way is to make the observation based upon a person who is going through the dying process and is in the clay-light state, which is, of course, raises some other ethical questions and so on.
The first person is Chairman Dwight.
Because one of the downside of that is that disadvantage of that is that there is no first possibility of a first person, self-report there. Now, the other option is to really find an advanced meditator who has attained this state, realization. But here,
while still alive.
No.
So that's very high sort of the experience, very high stage.
But it is from the Buddhist understanding. We are talking about a highly advanced state of realization, and there is a technical term. So, in fact, no. So it will have to be someone who has attained a state which is referred to as the illusory body attainment, and you're talking about such an advanced state. In fact, in the tradition, according to the tradition,
the practitioner is who can actually dissolve all the grosser level of mind as it dissolution
occurs at the time of death.
Then that person reach that experience, then almost certain within lifetime he can enlightened.
Become fully enlightened, yeah. So His Holiness was saying that.
So that is very rare. I think according to our circumstances, I think almost impossible. But you see, the training of that stage by stage.
So there are different.
So some preliminary way, preliminary stage, or practice that, I think possible. We may find some person, but so far I don't know. Maybe, sooner or later we should find. I don't know.
So His Holiness was saying, for example, like
then also you see I think very good sort of basis to investigate a person who actually control dream. For that, firstly, is the capacity realize dream is dream.
Recognition of dream as a dream. It's a bit like lucid dreaming, yeah.
Then during dream, they, according their own wish, you see, can perform different dreams.
Direct their dreams.
Oh. So there, I think we can test some of these such persons who have actually power of control dream. That eventually very possible to go through
the dissolution process,
right? To experience the deep sleep.
Clear light.
At that moment, clear light state of sleep experiencing. So some way, there is some possibility to test.
The point His Holiness is making is that somewhat analogous processes do occur naturally when we, in our day-to-day life, when we go to sleep through the dreaming. So from a waking state, when you go through the sleep state, the dream state is a slightly subtler state, and then the deep sleep state is a comparatively subtler state to this. So we go through an analogous process.
Many years ago, I met one French. He claimed to me he had the very clear sort of experience about dream body depart from his usual body. I was very skeptical. I don't know. So sometimes some Westerners is a little bit, you see. So really, I don't know whether that's reliable or not. I don't know. But in Tibetan, some Tibetan also you see have some strange sort of experience. The old body remain here 1 week, but the dream body depart actually from that body and visit different places. And after a week, you return, then that person clearly describe what happened other places. But during that period, whether you see the one official, now no longer, he served with me in 50s, like that. His own mother, so actually it happened that kind of experience. So old body remain here, looks like that. But now if such things will happen today, then I think a very good opportunity to test what is the brain movement.
So,
So His Holiness was to conclude the translation. His Holiness
How
was,
do
you say Tolokuba? So in a sense, His Holiness is saying that although we do not have these advanced realized meditators, but he's kind of whetting your appetite to tease you. So to finish the translation, His Holiness was saying that although from the kind of a textual description point of view, for example, like in the Guhyasamaja Tantra, many of these capacities are characteristics of a very advanced state, but somewhat analogous processes do occur naturally, and particularly with yogis who may have the capacity for lucid dreaming and also regulating their dream. For these kind of individuals, it may be possible that they can, once they have attained that capacity, to then go through the dissolution processes in the dream state and then have a somewhat similar experiences.
Dream state and sleep state.
Sleep state.
deep sleep.
Deep sleep
yes.
state.
Deep sleep.
And then it might allow some possibility of doing some kind of experiments.
What is the prevalence of that in the population? That is the capacity to do this during the dream state. Roughly, what percentage?
I think very rare.
That's a
And the more the Zonong Mare. And again, Zonzade.
There might be individuals, but
이만 무관으로 다시 시작해. 롱품진 소야시. 그러야고 요소도. 롱품진. 나다 나 거기 추루가 밀롱이냐면 이사야르데. 근데 이제 영어천도 아까 그때 인도한테 요점을 미신.
센트럴 머신가 맞다. 센트럴 머신 공부하더니 맞도 제 공부야 버려.
센트럴 머신. 하리 방수. 혹시 센트럴 머신.
There was some experiment done on Pokarambache, was a great practitioner. He was...
Then also another Rupa Kaiju, Kaza, Hong Sen Chisami. Reaching the way. Gulu Gigin Kenzi.
Gigin Kenzi.
Gigin Kenzi. And also some practitioner. But now most of them gone. They are not waiting. Our experiment, right?
May I ask a question, His Holiness? Some of the states that you have just been describing, they can be occurring under pathological conditions. There are certain psychoses where you have these out-of-body experiences. There are certain neurological diseases, especially with lesions in the parietal lobe, where people report exactly what you said, that they have their body lying and they see themselves floating above. And they can be mimicked. These states can also be generated now with virtual reality by making you behave and experiencing you through goggles and television systems in a completely different coordinate system. And if you do this for a while, you get the illusion that you leave your body and walk behind yourself. Some of these states you described, like this clear light state, is reported by people while they faint and when they come out of coma. Now, the worry I'm having a little bit is these are all borderline conditions where the brain processes dissociate, where the normal coordination of brain processes doesn't function anymore. Now, is it a goal of deep meditation to dissociate brain processes, to keep things apart, to make them fall apart so that you are left with isolated modules that then give you these very, very impressive but very rare experiences? And this probably could be investigated, whether you can, by internal training, decompose what is normally linked. Because
I just want to say one thing about the term meditation here, just a footnote, that this is a particular kind of meditation that is actually not that widely practiced, and that we wouldn't want to say, for example, that meditation on simply mindfulness on the breath would have the same types of effects, or that it would have anything to do. It's probably more integrative than it is about dissociation. So just a footnote in terms of what we mean by meditation there.
And also one striking feature is the few very exceptional meditators we are speaking about. We are mentioning a few names. You know, those are the most remarkable human beings among all those whom we have met. So in another way, they don't exhibit any of, say, fringe sort of, sort of behavior or state of mind or being at the edge of being whatever you might say. From other aspects, they're extremely well emotionally balanced, serene, peaceful, and whatever. So it comes more as an apex of developing qualities rather than going sort of weird symptoms of pathological states.
I am not saying that it's pathological. We know, for example, that people who had been in these extreme states Yeah, I mean, there may be a virtue to it, because there are these many reports that people who have, because of a disease process or a trauma or whatever, gone into these extreme states, they have changed personality, they have become very, very integrated, humble, and because they learned the borders of their existence. So
like near that experience.
it could be that getting yourself into these extreme experiences helps you enormously to manage your normal life. So you can have both. I don't think it's mutually exclusive.
So, Your Holiness, I'd like to just end with I think, a less controversial and more mundane question for you, which is, in the experiments that I described, we had practitioners rate the clarity of their experience. And I wonder, just in terms of helping us with the research in the future, what other dimensions or qualities of experience do you think could be most profitably studied in this way? Qualities that might vary within a practitioner and that may have important consequences for our life.
Thank you, Jushinda. Then Nyongwe said, "Chigumayimba." Then Rabat did the convention. Katakom Danizo, the tone, Jebachebe, Nasta Grants. The Keju can take that says a Rabat in the Shindachi Karit Jebachan Yaga spent on chair.
I don't know.
Nature.
Do you mean especially?
Same nature than temper than
Do you mean especially characteristics that you would have? Are you interested in other kinds of phenomenally reportable first-person characteristics that might track very clearly onto neuronal correlates? Is that what you're asking about?
Yes, that may vary over the course of meditation practice, or may vary as a practitioner gets more advanced. That we can track in terms of different brain correlates. So we've looked at just one dimension, clarity, but there are many, many dimensions, presumably, of reportable experience.
No.
Yes. And that's in first person, third person.
So the first thing probably would be to find people that you can experiment on, and then see how basically it's a kind of a trial and error. You keep asking the different aspects, but the problem is
so difficult to find first person. I don't know. I think this morning we touched, I think, secular ethics.
Ethics law.
My interest is in secular ethics on that level, not just this Buddhist thing.
No.
So then, I think secular ethics means the general public. Isn't it? Some of these individual, special case of individuals' experience. In any case, not much sort of use for public. So, for normal way or average way, to investigate about mental function, I think we already usually carry.
So one thing that might be helpful is that to find practitioners who specialize in the kind of
we call it energy.
the practice of the energy, the prana, or vayu. And these exist among non-Buddhist schools as well, traditions as well.
Non-Buddhist tantriyana. In remote place, some seems there. I met few. I don't know. Really reliable or not, I don't know. If we find some people who already have the ability of control breathing, and without breath remain, say, 1 hour, 2 hours.
2 hours without
breathing.
Without
breathing. So oxygen doesn't have shower.
So that means there is no intake of oxygen.
So that also really worthwhile to experiment. From the Buddhist viewpoint, these are not necessarily as a because of the spirituality, but simply exercise, physical exercise.
Skills. Skills.
Seljuk itself, nature, nature la takchi jina kanjure.
Nature quoi?
Nature. Seljuk the nature yorwa.
Nature. 요거로.
나 너서 다 냠렌치도 다 야게 연텐소 다 잠니지 다 되어라 봐라. 네 제식 되네지. 나다 제식 되네지 그래서 테스트 되어래. 근데 지바 남네 되네 다 심바 서버 숙션 보용도 서버 되
그래 당연시야.
근데 고수 당기요 매. 다들 소 내가 너서 다 되기요. 다디 마인바 직다 세큘라이티 게토라 다 너서 참니지 건가 야게 던 거라 봐라.
다 세큘라 나눠 옆에는 the body and the exercise as to jadi. 다들 여기 지도 jadi 야호도가.
네. 요가 송.
다들 요가 냠니셔니. 물론 내저 예를 들어 jadi 다시 제트네. 그 배경으로 봐요.
So given that we're talking about something that could be applicable in the wider secular ethics kind of context, those skills that are cultivated through the practice of the pranayama, the energy manipulation or whatever you want to call breath control, these, because they are not tied to specific religious ideas, and they will be much more amenable to this kind of secularization.
자, 나선데 사람들에게 지 고베서로 양지 통해서 이렇게 좀 못 읽고 가
His Holiness is asking Professor Ngawasamden, who's the director of the Central Institute in Sarnath. His Holiness was asking whether he has seen or heard
Varanasi is the center of ancient Indian spirituality. And many sadhus usually used to gather there. So in any case, I met I think one time I mentioned, some sadhus, I think a few dozen somewhere.
No.
Right.
About 30, 40.
I think 30, 40. Completely naked. So I was told that some of them remain whole year in snow mountain. So unless there is some practice, yoga practice, and usually we call inner heat, or tumu. Without that practice, impossible to remain whole year in the mountain, in snow mountain. Right? Some may be very liar.
Charlatans. Yeah.
But some very possible. I think I think worthwhile. See, we should investigate, inquire. If we find someone, then eventually, of course, firstly, we should get permission from that person, perhaps with some money.
We go to Adam for that.
Oh, yes. I think if we find some such person, I think really worthwhile.
Yeah.
That's a good enough.
무지무지 사실 딴데 요래. 사실 딴데 요래.
Your Holiness, the plan for this afternoon is for John to give a presentation of for the scientists to about consciousness from the Abhidharma perspective. More or less. And then Matthieu is going to talk also a little bit about consciousness from the Buddhist perspective, to familiarize the scientists with these views, and that will hopefully stimulate some discussion. Before we get to that, Ben wanted to make a comment about some of the information that you presented to us, some of your comments from the last session just before the tea break. So I'll just ask Ben to make these
Your
comments.
Holiness, as a physician, listening to the states that one can get into in the clear light state of suppressing so much of the body's metabolic function, it seemed initially to me that this was so miraculous that it was hard to imagine how it would occur. And during the tea break, Joan Halifax and I were talking about this. She suggested that there might be great medical utility if one could if one could do this for people, for example, undergoing life-threatening surgery, or people suffering wounds where they might be having excessive blood loss, if one could voluntarily induce this. Well, of course, the stories are anecdotal, so it was hard to know how one could ever do that. But in the conversation, I remembered that, that in fact, we have the capability in our bodies to synthesize hormones that will suppress metabolism. And we synthesize many hormones in our body that do different types of processes. Some of these are gases. It turns out that we have the capability to synthesize hydrogen sulfide gas, which in high concentrations is a toxic gas. But we can make that in our bodies. Chemically, we have the capability of doing that. And I just participated in beginning a company that is using hydrogen sulfide gas administered to people to suppress metabolism so that they can undergo surgery. So only when I thought about this in the context of these people did I realize that this might be an avenue to understanding how these people are able to do this remarkable thing. It is reasonable. It is scientifically reasonable that somehow in the practice these people learn how to change their metabolism. It would be a very unusual thing. And if they could elevate their levels, we all have hydrogen sulfide gas in our body circulating all the time. That's just a normal, but it's at a very low level. If we could elevate that to the levels that we're using in this company therapeutically, one would have the same effect as you're describing, not necessarily on the mental side, but on the physical side of maintaining the body in a suppressed metabolic state and allowing it to go on with no evidence of respiration, no evidence of heartbeat. Animals put in this position, and so forth. We're bringing this into human clinical trials now. But animals in this position have no heartbeat, they have no respiration. When you remove the hydrogen sulfide gas, they come back and are perfectly normal. So it's conceivable. This is obviously a wild hypothesis, but it is conceivable that these people have learned with their practice a way of regulating the amount of this gas to bring it to a level where it would do what we're doing in this company pharmaceutically as a drug, but they may be able to do it on their own. And I just thought that was an interesting link with physical reality of this miraculous behavior that you've described.
Very true. Because the meditator is actually an embodied person whose existence is directly tied to the physical body he has.
Thank you.
So this morning, Richie Davidson asked me if I would speak a little bit about some basic aspects of Buddhist models of consciousness. Obviously, this is not for the edification of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or, as I said, His Holiness the Karmapa, or any of the collected scholars here, but rather primarily for the audience members and for the scientists to help facilitate a little bit the discussion that might clarify some issues as we go forward. And first what I'll be speaking about is the notion of the mental stream of consciousness, which is the concept that consciousness flows through time as discrete moments. And I see we lack a little contrast there. Hopefully it's all right. So what we have are one moment of consciousness causally producing the next moment of consciousness, causally producing the next moment of consciousness. And this is the basic Buddhist model of consciousness when consciousness is considered from what would be considered the conventional perspective. And when we take so from a conventional perspective, we would speak of consciousness as moments, each moment, a discrete moment, causally producing the next moment, causally producing the next moment. And we can take one moment of consciousness and discuss it using a system of what's called mind and mental functions, or Semen Semjung, and I'm drawing on a particular text by Kachen Nishi Genzen. And in that context, we would say that in each moment of consciousness, which remember is a causal product, too bad about the contrast, I think the projectors are set wrong, actually. There must be 5 coordinate mental functions with each moment of consciousness. And these 5 are called feeling, or feeling tone, which is going to be positive, negative or neutral, or we can even say pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. Discrimination, which has to do with somehow picking out or selecting out the object. Attention, contact with the object, and then intentionality, or samba. Now, in addition to these 5, these must be minimally present for a moment of consciousness to occur. In addition to these 5, at least under normal conditions, there will be another 5, and these other 5 will occur, which are aspiration, interest, focus, which is often translated as mindfulness, although that's incorrect, really, concentration, and discernment. And these other 5 will be present when one has a full-blown Yungebinga. Dumba, Muba, Demba,
You really call temper focus?
Right now, it's better than mindfulness anyway. We won't get into it, will we? We can. And the problem, just to mention briefly, this is the term smrti in Sanskrit. The problem with the mindfulness is that there's a usage of mindfulness in the psychological literature that does not at all map onto smrti. So it's very confusing to translate it as mindfulness, especially in this context.
Slow down.
Okay. So we have aspiration, interest, focus, concentration, and discernment. Now, the reason I'm mentioning these and going rather quickly through them is that I'm not sure that the details of these particular functions are of great importance. What is important is the distinction between a consciousness which only has these 5 and a consciousness which has the other 5, a moment of consciousness. Because when all of the other 5 are present, then that consciousness produces a kind of cognition which is fully determinate, which fully determines its object. That is to say, it's going to be a conceptual cognition that correctly characterizes its object in a conceptual fashion. Whereas when only these first 5 are present, that kind of conceptual cognition is not occurring. All right? Now, it's not necessarily the case that all 5 need to be present for conceptual consciousness to occur. And there are many details and much discussion, and this is debated on the debating grounds, and we could certainly get into those details, but I'll avoid them for the moment, since I wouldn't win any of the debates anyway, I'm sure. A basic model of perception in Buddhism is that an object interacts with the sense faculty to produce an image in consciousness. So we have an external object, and this is based on a lower system, again, a conventional account. I'm going to be following a system that's often thought of as the Sautrantika system or Dharmakirti system. And so an object interacts with the sense faculties to create an image in consciousness, a nampa. And if we think of this as a causal process flowing through time, what we really have are three discrete entities. We have, first of all, here, a physical object. Then we have the sense faculties, which are going to be made of a subtle kind of physical matter. And then we have consciousness itself. Now, this is represented as an empty box. So then what happens is that we get an interaction in this first moment between the sense faculty and consciousness. And then in the next moment, although it may take more than just one moment, it may take more than one moment, we'll represent it as the second time. We get a representation of this object in consciousness. So consciousness is flowing along, and because of the interaction of the sense faculty with the object, that interaction changes, conditions consciousness in such a way that it arises with an image. Now, of course, also the faculty, the body, in effect, is also flowing through time, and the object is flowing through time. Now, technically, in this system, what we're actually contacting in sensation, this representation called the nampa in Tibetan, is the effect of this object in consciousness. This object presumably continues to flow through time, but we no longer have direct contact with that object. Now, in a subsequent moment, which we'll say is time 3, but in fact there may be many moments between the two, in a subsequent moment, what happens is that this image, which will be called perception, this is a perceptual image. Okay, so an actual moment of perception is this image. So that will be called the object image. And in fact, the box, we could say, represents subjectivity. It's kind of that which is holding or apprehending the image. So there will both be a sense of subjectivity and a sense of this representation as the object. In a subsequent moment, which we'll call time 3, this image goes through a certain kind of operation, which is called apoha, or exclusion, and is then conceptualized. And part of what happens when the image is conceptualized, and that conceptualization of the image is represented by the quotation marks here. And when it's conceptualized, it actually becomes a little bit vaguer, not quite as clear. The conceptual process renders it somewhat less clear, and that's represented by the dotted line and the slight change in the color. So this distinction is very important. There's a distinction between what is basically a sense datum, an uninterpreted sense datum, and then an interpretation of the sense datum conceptually. At this point, conceptual operations have not occurred. At this point, it's now conceptualized. And one can be aware at this point. But one is not necessarily aware. It's not necessarily the case that one gets a conceptual interpretation of a sense impression. Okay? Then so this is non-conceptual, and this is conceptual. And a couple other points. There's something that we can call, using a term from phenomenology, the notion of intentionality, which is that when this image arises, it's actually arising in consciousness, but it arises in such a way that it seems to be external. And secondly, when we have this conceptual image, again, even though this is actually occurring in consciousness, it also seems to project out into objects. as if it were referring to something in the world. So that's intentionality. One other important feature is conditioning. We have a kind of conditioning which is basically the conditioning of the body. In other words, just as an example, humans have certain types of sense faculties as a result of their karma, and individuals will have, in different physical states, their sense faculties may be impaired by disease or what have you. And this will also affect the way the sense faculty interacts with consciousness. Then there will be kinds of conditioning that are preconceptual. For example, if one is in a very intense emotional state, the kind of image that arises, if one is very angry, that can condition the way the perceptual image looks, as opposed to being in a very equanimous state. And then there will be conceptual conditioning. This would have to do, for example, with the type of language one has learned, the type of language one is using, cultural conditioning, and so on. And that is going to affect the way in which the concept arises. And then finally, in terms of concept formation, very briefly, what happens in this system is the use of what's called an exclusion process, which I represent as a black box, because exactly what happens is a bit mysterious. But basically what happens here is that the perceptual image... And the point here is that the concept, so for example, blue, if we think of this as being identified as blue, in fact, the concept is built upon this perceptual image. It is not an apprehension of some blueness that's the same as all blue objects in the world. In other words, it's not the case that all blue objects are actually the same. In fact, every object that we call blue is actually unique. We construct their sameness through a process of exclusion, and very briefly, this process works such that a blue object, what we call blue, is really excluded from that which is non-blue. It's excluded from that which does not have the causal characteristics of something that we call blue. That's a very complicated philosophical issue that we don't need to go into. So I think I'll just leave it there. The basic causal process, one more time, is that you get an object interacting with the sense faculty. Initially, you get an uninterpreted perceptual image arising in consciousness. One can have awareness at this time or not. And when we were using the term conscious this morning, really the question is whether or not this is brought into awareness or not. If it is conceptual, one will always be aware of it. But it's not necessarily the case, I don't have that represented here, it's not necessarily the case that the perceptual image will be interpreted conceptually. All right, I think I'll just leave it there.
John, can you say in what sense...
you want me to put that back up? Yeah. Maybe there'd be some questions about this.
In what sense the preconceptual is, you said you used the term uninterpreted.
Oh, yes. Okay. So maybe you put the conditioning is actually important here. When I say that it's uninterpreted, and I'm sure His Holiness would have a lot to say about this, but when I say it's uninterpreted, that simply means it has not been conceptualized. So it has not been labeled, if you will, with a term.
Interpretation
But that doesn't mean that it's completely unconditioned. Again, your emotional states, the type of physical faculties that one has, the unique character, what one is thinking about before the arisal of the image, everything that's going on in one's mental continuum here is going to have some kind of effect on the type of perceptual image that arises. So, at least on my interpretation, as I understand this, when we all look at something red, for example, we don't all have exactly the same image or nampa in our consciousness. We all have slightly different images in our consciousness because each of our consciousnesses are slightly different. Any other?
So if we saw a red apple,
다시 좀 보면 잘.
나 말해.
그것은 남아대서 미래를 대해서 만다오래. Yeah.
Easy.
well, I'll ask this, then you can ask yours. So if you took a red apple, for example,
Yes.
If you were hungry and you saw the red apple, we would say from the perspective of psychology and neuroscience that there would be mechanisms in the brain that would interpret that, if you will, as a food cue, and it would have a different relation than if you were filled to satiety, if you were no longer hungry. So how
I think probably on this system.
라. 간다 비가 돈을 맞지 기와 그러면. 구시 돈도 가네. 저것도 50도 되는 남자 사회 세게 남발 차고.
This is actually an interesting question. 누구 또 나한테니 문송계 남부터 만다오치 기획을 위해서.
근데 세게 남발 기.
누구 또 나로 봐. 문송계 남부 코람 만다오치 기획을 위해. So if I nga khala se tsane tini nga 누구 matona tini 문송계 남부 직제 요로 봐. 때 sabla nga kushu 직을 때니 nga bet 누구 또나 문송계 남부 셴베치 기획을 위해 만다오치 기획을 위해. 야마나
네 가지고 싶은 분이나 한번 나셔기나 아예 안 되나
그지
가보면 no
what's that?
I think it's
love kabudu.
yeah
It's probably the same.
내가 지르서는 때 떡을 벌렸었어
나리
예 떡을 갑라 텐테 용으로 봐.
맞다 내가 지르서네
더블레서
떡을 벌렸어 말
Oh, yeah. See, one question here would be, by the time, an interesting question here would be, would that type of state, let's say, of intense hunger, condition the perceptual image? Or, His Holiness was saying, actually, by the time if I'm identifying it as something desirable, I'm already at a conceptual level. And it's certainly the case that there would be a distinction. If I'm hungry or not hungry, I might not even get a concept. I might not even, I will have this perhaps as my eyes pass over the table, but I might not even interpret it as anything. Or I might interpret it and say, oh yes, that's a red object, or there's an object there. But if I'm hungry, then I'm definitely going to interpret it as something edible or an apple. So certainly there would be a difference in interpretation at the conceptual level, but there might not be a difference at the perceptual level.
Well, the neuroscience would say definitively that there would be a difference at the perceptual level, unequivocally.
but then here maybe there's a difference in the way in which the term perception is used.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean it would affect the...
Actually, this is a good thing. Can I say one thing? I mentioned the other day, and I don't know the name of this study, but I know that there is a study in which they took pigeons and they trained them to recognize, and pigeons have no evolutionary need to identify fish. So they took pigeons and they trained them to identify in postcards fish. And they could repeatedly identify fish. Now on the Buddhist view, they are using concepts because they are repeatedly have something they know to be, but they don't have the word fish, but they have a conceptual function which repeatedly identifies the same kind of thing. Now, generally, the way the word concept is used in cognitive science, that would not be a concept on most usages, I think. But this is something that we might call a proto-concept or a very primitive concept.
Well, although there's a lot of work showing the concept development prior to the onset of language in human development.
Yes, okay. So, in any case...
No.
I think that would be helpful.
But so I think the point here would be that there may be some disagreement about, though you're saying in neuroscience, definitively there would be a difference, but the argument might be here that in neuroscience you're not actually detecting this. You're not detecting the raw percept. The claim would be most ordinary people don't we're not generally aware, we're not generally aware of this at this level either.
Well, for example, in terms of neuroscientific data, if you record from primary visual cortex, the first relay station in visual cortex as the information comes up from the periphery.
Yes, there will be a difference there.
Correct.
Right at the beginning.
Right at the beginning.
In
So-
blind sight, is there a difference?
Pardon?
Something like blind sight, or the kind of situation that Wolf was speaking about, of a forced choice situation, will there also be a difference in conditioning?
I'm not exactly sure of the question in terms of blind sight.
Well, if he says that you're not aware of, you're not seeing anything, okay? It's prior to any conscious red apple out there. And yet if you force a choice to react one way or the other, then there's a precognitive or subliminal, some sort of subconscious process which allows you to do that.
Well, I
I'm
mean, you
wondering
can
whether they're
record
pointing to
activity in 150 milliseconds after a stimulus that will differentiate between certain conditions of the organism. For example, whether the organism is hungry versus sated, or if the stimulus is accompanied by reward versus punishment. So it happens extremely quickly, and it happens in the primary sensory cortex. But I think Wolf had a point. Well, there are several.
simple levels. D level correct tone.
But I would say myself, and I think there was even a little bit of doubt whether there would be a difference or not. I don't think that is really contradictory to this system. Entirely possible that would be considered a kind of preconceptual physical conditioning. The organism is prepped and will respond in that way. So whether or not that's conceptual might be a matter of, and then the other question, of course, is there a deeper level that is not being captured?
And also some of these processes can be so fast.
So fast. Very, very, very fast.
So that needs to be taken into account.
Yes, extremely quick.
Which is consistent with how we would think.
Yeah, the conceptualization is in ordinary persons is instantaneous.
For example, like a distinction is made in Buddhist epistemology of perceptions that are perceived but cannot lead to kind of awareness, and then there are
they can't lead to this basically.
Yeah, that cannot lead to this, and then there are perceptual experiences that can lead to awareness, and the difference is whether or not the person is attending to the object being perceived. So, to take your example of someone who is very hungry, and because of that state of mind, when there's going to be much stronger attention, and that is going to lead to immediately to this conceptual level. That's going to have an immediate effect.
Did you?
This is just a question of clarification in how you're using the terms. So as I understand it, the image, the preconceptual image, is in consciousness.
Yes.
But the conceptualized image is you're describing as an object of awareness. So
they're both. Well, it depends on how we define awareness. But if we there's a term shepa. They're both occurring in shepa, in awareness.
So the question then that I have is...
They are part of awareness, actually.
Okay. The question then that I have is, what is the defining characteristic of consciousness such that the image, the preconceptual image, is conscious?
No, it's to you. It's and the Wangshiki, you number that make a topic number the Tunjana. The topic you number the Tunjins and the Tunji. Tunji is at the Tunji, you got the Teonian Belotki and you got Lamsa, never did to Yorba, the Teonian.
Koso nichela shepares.
No.
She's encouraging nichela shepalab chogres. Koso ngoni jena Kurangi chibadire shebi tseni karere nam sheki.
No, that's not your question. What's your question, Evan?
I think that's his question.
The question is, the image is said, the preconceptual image is said to be conscious rather than not conscious. So
It's a
within this
conscious state,
system,
yes.
it's a conscious state. So within
what
this
sense?
system, what is the defining characteristic of consciousness?
And then, the toko ma je kong wang shi kebe kaluya number yul chagorwa number lo chadu gala ni number ribati shigdus number lo chavate the indical the number sheba se shebe khode khaja
유리주고 말해. 유리시로.
나린
I think
유리시는 예만 되면 나가로.
나린. So because the object is experienced, so that's there is an awareness there because the object is experienced.
But
And
it
it's
may-
cognized, actually.
Yili nala mengeba yena experience lamna kanudo.
뭐지? 야 나는 말이죠.
The experience you're
I think there's a possible argument there. If we consider definition of consciousness as
책임인가? vocabulary.
It may be more to do with terminology, the way in which we're using the terms conscious. Yeah.
But maybe to exemplify, consciousness is a stream of momentaneous events, of what we call consciousness, but of which we not be aware of all of them. Now, why do we say that even we are not aware of that moment too, but it's still part of the stream of consciousness? To prove that, if you were to remove that moment and put the unconscious instant there, then the stream will be blocked and you will not see the rest. So it's integral part of that flow, whether you are fully conceptually aware or not. It is still part of what we call the stream of instant of consciousness. It doesn't have to come to your perception or intelligence, but it is integral part of that stream, because without that, the stream will be broken and you will not perceive the conceptual thing.
Yeah, so there is a difference here in terms of the way to be conscious or consciousness is used. It's certainly not the case that if we're going to use consciousness to translate this term simply Shepa, then it's not necessarily the case that one is aware in the sense that one can report on each moment of Shepa.
But still it's part of stream of consciousness, because without those moments, then it will not work.
So they will affect aware.
They will not happen.
Yeah.
So this is a necessary moment in the momentaneous continuity of what we call instant of consciousness.
No, the Kasa Quran Nyobugi
Yes, then really
Shena Machine. Tagado Muntu
유리주고.
No, the Benana Surgina.
normal 여기니.
In a condo, Yudi Sheva Shagres, Kasa Qurangi, the Yudi Tongsonia, Never Dentone Matune.
가다 유된 넘버 남자 계산 쉬워.
Because the very fact that the awareness has arisen in taking on the aspect of the object, that defines it as a moment of consciousness. So here I'm using the term what John has translated as perceptual image, as sometimes it's also translated as aspect. It's an aspect of the object that is assumed by the awareness.
Yeah, the model here, just to clarify, is that what happens between this moment and this moment is that consciousness itself takes on the form of the object.
But not yet of a concept.
But
But not yet of a concept.
But not conceptual.
Yes.
If it's conceptual, it will always be something that you can report on.
Which is manifest, actualized.
You can report on this too after you conceptualize it. In other words, you can be aware at this level, although most ordinary people are not aware at this level.
So there's really a big difference between our view and this view, because we would see a continuous stream of processing going from A to B to C to D, which never ends as long as the brain is working. And only glimpses out of this permanent stream are selected by attention and pushed into the workspace of consciousness. And only those can be conceptualized thereafter. So these would be sideways bifurcations that need or need not occur, because what happens here, if if one doesn't make it into the stream, if one out of the stream doesn't make it into consciousness, then your chain breaks.
No.
Because
as John said, there could be many moments in between T1 and T2 and T3.
There could be other moments. And the stream, of course, definitely goes on. But what you're saying is that there's sort of a parallel stream here that maybe something is bumped into this level, which would be not conceptualized.
Yeah.
You could run in this stream for as long as you want. If you keep in the other stream, the conscious stream, something that you want to maintain in working memory, for example, then many of these blobs would run in parallel, not going to consciousness at all. Then you shift your focus of attention, you select another one out of that stream, and then you are in another conscious state. So
I don't think there is a contradiction, if I can speak in my voice, because let's not forget that there are 5 sensory modalities. So it's not just one, when one sensory modality operates, the others are shut. So you can imagine all the 5 sensory modalities, these awareness are taking place. Now where the conceptual thought arises, that is the function of selection.
And only one at a time.
So you can be, for example, watching, and a typical example given is you could be watching a theater show where you may be smelling some beautiful, fragrant flower. You are watching this beautiful, attractive dance that is being performed, and you hear the music. So all the 5 sensory modalities are active, but what you attend to is going to lead to that stream.
Another way of thinking about this is that there are times when one just has these minimal functions that permit consciousness, and then there's a time when... Right? So that's another way of thinking about this.
Martha, did you have a...
I did. I want to kind of question head-on the assumption that there is a categorical difference between perception and conceptualization. And I think this is very sort of in keeping with what Wolf was saying, but maybe I'll be more, even more direct about it. It's very tempting to want to believe that you can draw a sharp, bright line between perception and cognition. I think for epistemological reasons, somebody actually used the word sense data earlier today. Yeah, that was you. Okay. So, if you believe that there is perception that is the interaction of a part of your body, your eye or your ear with the outside world, and then later you operate on those representations with thought, you have some possibility of correct knowledge about the world. This is sort of the positivist program in philosophy, right? But I think everything we know empirically tells us that, in fact, it's a very long kind of cascade, step by step by step, going from the most peripheral perceptual representations, in the case of vision, the retina, to the most high-level conceptual representations. And if you'll indulge me for a minute, I just want to elaborate that a little bit. So, perceptually, if I see this white piece of paper, okay, if I see it from here or if I see it from here, different photoreceptors are being stimulated on my retina. So those are really 2 different perceptual representations, right?
Yes.
And likewise, even at the level of primary visual cortex, the representation of that and the representation of that are totally distinct, totally non-overlapping.
That's also on this.
Okay. However, at a slightly higher level of visual representation, somewhere down in inferotemporal cortex, where Wolf showed you before, the representation of this object here and here becomes identical. They sort of converge.
And that's at time 3.
Well, hang on. Now, at yet later levels of representation, the representation of this and this, in other words, the retinal image of, the rectangle versus a parallelogram versus just skinny little line, right, are similarly mapped onto a common representation, and therein lies our, what psychologists call shape constancy, the ability to see that this is actually the same shape object, even though the image that it casts on our retina is totally different at these different angles. Okay, this process of step by step by step making categories or concepts, like you were saying, right, goes on all the way up to the highest conceptual levels. So now let's go to the other end of the spectrum, and that's really what I want to argue, that it's a spectrum. Conceptually, you might have the knowledge that paper is made from trees. It's a wood product, that people write on it, and also that it's typically white and flexible. Well, we know that patients with localized brain damage to certain parts of temporal cortex can lose just the knowledge of the visual characteristics of the paper. So you can say, what's paper made from? And they will say, oh, it's cellulose, it's a wood product. And you can say, and what color is it? And they say, I don't know, white, black, purple? They don't know. So in other words, even at the other end of the spectrum, we continue to gradually transform the information from perceptual to conceptual. There's good computational reasons for doing that. If you try to train a neural network to go from a visual image to conceptual information, it turns out it works much better if you do it through these gradual steps rather than try to do the mapping in one step. Mm-hmm. So there's good reason to believe that our brains are designed like that for a reason. Now, I'm going on for so long, I'm losing my place. Let me just say, okay, so basically there's a spectrum from perceptual to conceptual. There's no place where you can draw a line and say everything under this is perceptual and everything over that is conceptual. And that same kind of gradient, that same gradual difference corresponds to the relative balance of innate, sort of hardwired, determined influences on the representation versus learned. So, basically we all, we can see the equivalence of this and this just by virtue of being, born with a full normal genome, right?
So maybe I give you one answer to that, and then let Jimpala translate.
Okay.
Which
well,
is the line.
Let me say one last
sorry.
thing. So I apologize for going on so long, but I do think that some of the problems that we're having may actually just come from the fact that we're starting off assuming a categorical distinction. And I think if we admit that perhaps sort of the conceptual content of our representations and the availability of these representations to consciousness are all on a gradient, the problems that we're grappling with might be easier to solve.
spectrum
유디 통신배 물이야 또 똑바로 비행으로 디니고 쓰므로 유디 가사를 제기 똑바로 되면 돼. 좋아.
So this could be actually quite true, and particularly with respect to the conceptual thoughts that arises while you are actually looking at the object at the same time.
However, I don't think that there would be a total abandonment of the distinction between the conceptual and the non-conceptual. Just to say what the dividing line is, you mentioned it, it's when two things are made one. So at the point that there's a process that takes two stimuli and interprets them as the same, that counts as a concept. And everything above that's a concept. Yeah. Everything above that. And then there's not a lot of theory about how you get from there to language.
너를 왕실 나 두고 넘버 디다 디니카레스. 넘버 집어 자고도 와서. That's very true. Yeah.
Then it's concepts.
유지 제고.
Yeah. Because you need chickpeas. Intimate is not chickpeas the kidney lab gumendo. Very low in the shana, then
In the last 2 minutes, I'd just like to ask Matthieu to make a few comments and help integrate this.
Well, it's not really that. Well, the ultimate nature of consciousness in 2 minutes, that's a nice challenge. Well, we have been talking about the Buddhist perspective on what is experience and consciousness as opposed to the inanimate. And so here, also the notion of consciousness is a primary phenomena, which Evan referred to on the first day. So quickly, what a primary phenomena might be, for instance, in the case of matter, we can go down to the most elementary subatomic particles, or quarks, or superstrings, or quantum vacuum, and at some point, we stop there. We just have to acknowledge phenomena are there, and we cannot really answer why there is something rather than nothing, unless we bring, a creator or something else. So this is what we call chöni in Tibetan. This is the nature of things, and one of the categories which we referred to in the first day. So what about consciousness in that case? Well, if we don't mix the third and the first person experience, but we can describe perhaps with great precision what it is to feel love, what it is to see red, but without the experience of it, the very word of consciousness will not be part of our vocabulary. It will be absolutely no meaning. So there is definitely a dimension of experience which has its quality of its own, which is very special. So now, to be honest, we should lead an investigation. So if we really want to speak of the first person experience and experience as a phenomena, we should honestly pursue its investigation within its own domain of experience. Now what happens if we do that? Then we first come to mental construct, memory, imagination, hopes and fears, and all what emotions and whatever fills our mental landscape. But now if we go further down into that, say behind the screen of thoughts and mental concepts, there is definitely a basic quality of cognition that is, we call the luminous aspect of mind, that is luminous compared to an object that is dark in terms of cognition. There's absolutely no cognitive quality whatsoever. So now, if we refine that experience to introspection, we can come to what we call pure cognition, pure awareness, pure consciousness, whatever we may call that, which is the purest faculty of cognition that allows every other type of cognition, whether it's reasoning, emotions, feeling, without which we will not speak of experience, we will not speak of consciousness. So now when we come to that pure awareness, in a way we could say it's also a primary phenomena in the sense that further than that, further than pure cognition without content, there's nowhere deeper we can go. We cannot say why it's there rather than not there unless we bring some extraneous explanation. So from the perspective of experience itself. So from that perspective of experience, this is a primary phenomena because we have no further explanation. We certainly don't come to the brain or neurons. Even in ancient time, people who said it's in the heart. That shows how little we have an insight as it happens in the brain. So now that's one point of this notion of what we call bare or pure consciousness. And the reasoning for speaking of a continuum is the reasoning we mentioned of the first day of two. We're not talking in the long-term evolution of the complexification of biology and nervous systems, but the instant causation of moment to moment, as we say that there should be a similar nature from one minute moment to the next in the law of causation. It just cannot happen. Anything leads to anything. So that community of nature requires that the very present moment of consciousness, the very immediately preceding one, has to be somehow of the same nature. It cannot come of something that is absolutely devoid of any conscious quality. So this logic leads to have the notion of a continuum of consciousness. And in the same way that when we mention about ex nihilo creation, that nothing cannot become something, so in the realm of phenomenal sort of inanimate object, we cannot go from nothingness to something and then from something to nothingness. The Buddhist logic about that is that there should be also a continuum of consciousness that is also also beginningless. That's the reasoning behind the notion of a stream of consciousness that goes on from states of being to another. So that's the ultimate first-person experience also.
Thank you, Matthieu. And thank you, Your Holiness, for a very rich day, and we look forward to continuing.
Thank you. Very interesting to share.